Matthew opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a deed of gift transferring 49% of the Langford family holdings to the Matthew Langford Foundation, a new charitable entity with Matthew as sole director, and an irrevocable trust containing $1.2 billion in seed money. David smiled. Dad always said there was only one true Langford. Turns out he was right. It just wasn't me by blood. It was you by choice. Matthew tried to speak, failed, and simply hugged him again, harder this time. Behind them, the mansion windows glowed gold. Inside, 20 foster children from the county, kids who had never known a permanent home, were eating their first dinner at the long mahogany table that had once seated senators and kings. David put an arm around his brother's shoulders. "Come on," he said. "Let's go introduce you to your board of directors. They've been waiting to meet the man who's going to give them the future I never had." Matthew laughed through tears. "You're insane." "No," David answered, steering him toward the light. "I'm just done letting other people write my story." And under the Virginia stars, the golden boy finally claimed the only inheritance that had ever really been his, the right to decide who his family would be. The mansion never felt empty again. David turned to the room, voice perfectly calm. "My father was coerced. The new trust is fraudulent. I have filed emergency petitions in 3 jurisdictions. As of 9 a.m. this morning, every account, every entity, every painting has been frozen by court order pending investigation." He looked at Celeste. "You have 72 hours to vacate the East Wing." Then at Pierce, who was already sweating through his $5,000 suit. "Reginald, the U.S. Attorney's Office would like a word." Finally, to Matthew, whose eyes were wide and wet. "You're not part of this. You never were." Celeste found her voice. "David, Sherry, we can talk." "No," he said gently. "We're done talking." The fallout was biblical. Celeste was indicted within the month. Pierce took a plea and testified against her. The judge voided the fraudulent trust and reinstated the original. David inherited everything outright. But the money was never the point. 1 year later, on a crisp spring evening, David stood on the terrace where he had once overheard the truth. The gardens were lit with lanterns, a long table had been set for 20. Matthew arrived last, still in work boots from the barn, looking nervous. David met him at the steps. "I have something for you," David said, and handed him a thick legal envelope. "Mr. David." "I'm so sorry," Matthew said, voice cracking. I never expected, your father was always good to me, but I never thought." David hugged him. A real hug, fierce and sudden. Matthew stiffened in surprise, then hugged back. "You were family to him," David said against his shoulder. "That matters." He meant it. That was the moment Matthew decided David Langford was the best man he'd ever known. 2 weeks later, the will was read in the library. Reginald Pierce cleared his throat and began the recitation. Celeste sat regally in a black Chanel, lips faintly curved. Matthew sat beside her, pale and clearly wishing he were anywhere else. When Pierce reached the line, "To my son Matthew Langford, I bequeath the entirety of the residue estate," Celeste let one perfect tear slide down her cheek for the assembled witnesses. David waited until Pierce closed the leather folder. Then he stood. "Before anyone leaves," he said quietly, "there's something you should all see." He pressed a button on the remote in his hand. The hidden screen descended from the ceiling. A video began to play, Celeste, 6 years earlier, in Victor's bedroom, holding his hand while he signed the new trust, Victor clearly drugged, pupils pinprick, voice slurred. Audio of Celeste and Pierce discussing how much morphine was safe. Bank records show Pierce's Cayman account receiving $8 million the day after signing. Hospital records proving Victor's dementia diagnosis had been hidden from David. And finally, the original 2005 trust, never legally revoked, naming David as sole heir, was witnessed by 3 doctors who were still alive and willing to testify. Celeste's mouth opened, but no sound came. Matthew looked as though someone had punched him in the stomach. David smiled at breakfast, held Celeste's hand at Victor's bedside, and told Matthew the new folding barn design was brilliant. He asked Matthew to teach him how to repair the old stone walls, spent Saturdays hauling limestone beside him, laughing when mortar smeared both their shirts. He listened to Matthew talk about his childhood in Loudoun County, about a father he'd never known, about how grateful he was to Mr. Langford for giving him a job straight out of high school. Inside, David was ice. He hired the best forensic genealogist money could buy, flew to Switzerland for discreet banking records, and paid a retired FBI agent to pull every document Victor had ever signed in the last 5 years. The picture that emerged was surgical in its cruelty. Celeste and Victor's lawyer, Reginald Pierce, had crafted a new trust 6 years earlier, the day Matthew turned 21. Victor, already showing early dementia, had been persuaded that protecting the true bloodline was noble. David's name appeared exactly twice, once as executor of the house, which carried a $14 million debt against it, and once as recipient of a $75,000 annual allowance for sentimental reasons. Matthew, listed as Matthew Langford, son, inherited the liquid $2.4 billion, the offshore entities, the art, the stocks, everything that actually mattered. Victor died on a rainy October morning. The funeral was perfect, black horses, bagpipes, the governor in attendance. Celeste wore veiled couture and clung to David's arm like a bereaved widow. Matthew stood at the back in his only suit, eyes red, looking lost. That night, after the last guest left, David found David alone in the study. The night Victor slipped into the final coma, Celeste found David in the library at 2 a.m. She pressed a crystal tumbler of 50-year Macallan into his hand and curled beside him on the leather sofa like a cat. "He changed the will last week," she whispered, tears glittering prettily. "Everything is taken care of. You will never have to worry." David assumed she meant he was taken care of. He assumed wrong. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, he walked the long corridor to get water and heard her voice drifting from the terrace doors she'd left cracked open against the August heat. "No, darling, he still has no clue," Celeste laughed, low and intimate, cigarette ember glowing. 18 years of calling him the golden boy, and the fool still thinks the trust fund is his by blood. Victor signed everything over to our real son the day he was born. Matthew gets it all. David gets the house and a stipend, poor lamb. A man's voice, younger, amused. "You're wicked." "I'm practical," she corrected Celeste. "Matthew is blood. David is, a beautiful mistake Victor made before he met me." David stood frozen in the shadows, glass trembling in his hand. Matthew was the quiet groundskeeper who had worked the estate for 15 years, lived in the converted stables, kept to himself, and the horses. David had always liked him, 28, polite, dark-haired, with a shy half-smile and hands that could calm the most fractious stallion. Victor had paid for Matthew's mother's funeral 10 years earlier. David had thought it a charity. Now he understood it was guilt. He did not slam the door. He did not scream. He walked back to the library, poured the Macallan down the bar sink, and began to plan. The next 6 months were a masterclass in performance. David Langford had always believed he was the last true Langford. The estate sprawled across 400 acres of rolling Virginia horse country, white fences, ancient oaks, a limestone mansion built in 1919 that still smelled faintly of cigar smoke and lemon polish. Every brick, every portrait, every silver service, and thoroughbred in the stables carried the same whispered promise: "One day, all of this will be yours, golden boy." Victor Langford, his father, had said it 1,000 times. Widowed when David was 7, Victor never remarried in any meaningful sense. There had been women, of course, but only one who ever moved into the East Wing, Celeste Duval, 31 to Victor's 63, a former Paris runway model with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a laugh that made men forget their own names. Within a year she was Celeste Langford, and within 2 she was signing Christmas cards, Mommy Celeste. David, 19 and home from Princeton for the holidays, had rolled his eyes at the nickname but let it pass. She was kind to him in a theatrical way, always touching his arm when she spoke, always calling him my golden boy with the soft French R's that still clung to her tongue. Victor's health began failing at 78. First the heart, then the kidneys, then the slow, dignified surrender to machines that beeped in the mahogany-paneled bedroom. David moved back home permanently, running the family office, sitting at hospital bedsides, signing papers Victor could no longer hold a pen to. Celeste floated through it all in silk robes and perfume, kissing Victor's forehead, telling David, "You are such a good son. He is so proud."